You lack the steel required for this life. This life
isn't going to change. And the thing that wasn't going to change stood 5 feet tall in a black widow's dress on the porch of the Dunbar Ranch. And her name was Agnes. The valley had a shorthand for her. Old Agnes Dunbar would freeze the milk in a cow. Mothers used her to settle unruly children. And every hopeful young woman who'd ever set her cap at the Dunbar place, and there had been a few, for Wes was a good man with good land, had come away from a Sunday supper at that ranch pale and shaken, and suddenly remembering a prior engagement. No bride would survive my mother. Wes told anyone who asked why he hadn't married. He believed it the way he believed in gravity, which is why he never once saw it coming. The Sunday his mother set down her fork and asked him when the wedding was. He'd tell you, if you got him talking, that his mother had chased off every woman who ever came courting distance of him. And that was true as far as it went. What Wes Dunbar could not have told you, because he long ago stopped looking closely enough to know it, was why. He thought it was cruelty or possessiveness or simple hardness of heart. He was wrong on all 3 counts. But a man raised inside a fortress rarely thinks to ask what the walls are keeping out or what they're keeping in. It would take a widow with a history of her own to walk up to those walls and knock and wait to be let in. The Dunbar Ranch sat in a fold of the Montana hills, good grass and good water, run for 30 years by a woman who'd buried the man who started it. Agnes Dunbar had come west to bride herself, and the West had charged her the usual price. It took her husband to a horse fall when Wes was 12. It took 2 babies to the fevers before that, and it took her daughter. Eliza Dunbar had been 19 and quick and full of light, and she died of childbed fever 3 years back with a quilt half-finished in her lap. And after that, Agnes Dunbar had gone from stern to something harder, and the door to Eliza's room had closed, and nobody in that house had opened it since. The valley saw a dragon. The valley had not been watching very carefully. Wes was a good son and a lonely man, and he'd resigned himself to being both forever. He'd watched it happen too many times. A hopeful young woman at the Sunday table, and his mother's cold appraising eye, and the questions that landed like slaps, and the girl's brave smile crumbling by the dried apple pie. None of them came back. Wes had decided, somewhere in his 30s, that it was kinder not to start. Kinder to the women, who deserved better than a trial by Agnes. Kinder to himself, who'd stopped believing there was a woman alive who could sit at that table and not flinch. No bride would survive my mother, he'd say and shrug, and go back to his cattle. He said it so often, he never heard the second thing hiding inside it, that a man who won't let anyone near his mother is, more often than not, a man who won't let anyone near himself. Ruth Calloway came to the Dunbar Ranch in the spring, hired. Agnes's hip had gone bad over the winter, bad enough that the housework outran her for the first time in her life, and Wes had put out word, quietly, braced for his mother's fury, that they needed a woman to help through the season. Ruth answered it, a widow mid-30s, from 2 counties over, where fever had taken her husband and, the same hard year, the only child she carried to term. She arrived with one trunk and a stillness about her that Wes couldn't place at first. He placed it eventually. It was a stillness of someone who has already lost the worst thing and is no longer afraid of the smaller ones, including, as it turned out, his mother. Agnes tested her the first evening, the way she tested everyone. She was cruel about the supper, the biscuits too hard, the coffee too weak, said in a voice meant to draw blood. Wes braced for the familiar sight of a woman wilting. Ruth Calloway looked at the old woman a long, level moment. The biscuits are hard because your flour's gone slightly off in the damp, and nobody's told you because they're all afraid of you. Ruth said, calm as still water. I'll sort the flour tomorrow. The coffee's weak because you're rationing it, which is sensible, and I'll not waste it making it strong to flatter you. The kitchen went very quiet. Wes closed his eyes, waiting for the explosion. Agnes Dunbar studied the widow for a long moment. We'll see, she said. It was not. Wes realized with astonishment. A no. Here is the thing Wes Dunbar missed, because he was out on the range from dawn to dark all that spring. Ruth and his mother were in that house together, all day, every day. And a strange thing grew between them, slowly, in the way of 2 hard, honest women. that he never saw a moment of. Ruth didn't flatter Agnes, and she didn't fear her, and she didn't try to manage her the way the hopeful brides had. All false sweetness and nervous laughter. Ruth simply worked beside her and spoke to her plainly and gave exactly as good as she got. And Agnes, who had spent 3 years being handled like unexploded powder by a whole valley of people who found it easier to fear her than to know her, Agnes found, to her own surprise, that she'd started looking forward to the mornings. Wes fell in love the way careful men do, slowly, and then all at once, and then in secret, even from himself. He'd come in from a range, and there'd be Ruth at the stove, and something in his chest would ease that hadn't eased in years. But he did nothing about it. He told himself it was for her sake. Ruth was a good woman, a kind woman, and she had grief enough for one life. She didn't need to be shackled to the Dunbar place and its terrible old mistress, worn down by Agnes the way all the others had been worn down. He'd let her finish the season and pay her fare, and let her go on to a better life somewhere his mother couldn't reach. It was a noble thing. It was, though he had died before admitting it, also the cowardly thing, because a man who's watched his father and his sister lowered into ground learns, if he's not careful, that the safest way not to lose someone is never to hold him in the first place. Wes Dunbar had learned it too well. The wall between Agnes and the rest of the world had one door, and it was the door to Eliza's room, and nobody opened it. Ruth found it one afternoon, dusting the hall. Closed, the knob for the particular dust of a place no hand touches. She didn't force it. She asked, "Whose room, Agnes?" The old woman went rigid. 3 years, and not one soul in that valley had dared ask her a direct question about her dead girl. They tiptoed. They changed the subject. They let her grief calcify in a closed room, because her grief frightened them nearly as much as she did. Ruth Calloway was not frightened. "My daughters," Agnes said, the words like gravel. "Eliza, she's been gone 3 years." "Don't." Ruth was quiet a moment. "I buried a child too," she said. "Different kind, but I know the room you don't open." A breath. "You don't frighten me, Agnes Dunbar. I think you've been frightening people for 3 years, so nobody gets close enough to leave you again." Agnes Dunbar did not answer that. She turned and walked away, spine straight as a fence post, and Ruth thought she'd gone too far. But that evening, the old woman set 2 cups of coffee on the table, strong, unrationed, and sat down across from the widow, and after a long while said, in a voice scraped down to something almost soft, she was making a quilt when she went. Eliza never finished it. And that was the beginning of it. Over the next weeks, in the slow way of grief that's finally allowed to speak, Agnes told Ruth about her daughter, the light of her, the quickness, the half-finished quilt folded in a cedar chest behind a closed door. 2 women who had buried people and kept going, talking in the kitchen while a man rode the range outside, entirely unaware that the fortress he'd lived inside his whole life had just quietly opened a window. "We'll see," Agnes had said that first hard evening. She'd seen. What she'd seen was this, that after 3 years of Valley treating her like a natural disaster, one woman had walked in and treated her like a person, a grieving mother, a widow, a human being with a dead girl she was allowed to mention. And Agnes Dunbar, who was not a dragon, but only a woman who'd built dragon walls against a world that kept taking everything she loved, had made a decision. She wanted Ruth Calloway in that house forever, not as hired help, as kin, the daughter the fever took, in whatever way the living can ever replace the dead, which is not all, and yet somehow, sometimes, a little. There was only one difficulty. The one person who couldn't see any of it was the one person who had to marry the woman. The season ended in the fall, the way seasons do. Agnes's hip had mended. The arrangement was up, and Ruth Calloway had a letter from a household in Helena that wanted a housekeeper, because a widow with no husband and no child cannot simply stay where she has no claim, however much the mistress of the house has come to love her. Wes knew she was leaving. He'd known the date for weeks, and still he said nothing. He'd catch himself at the edge of it, a word half-formed, a hand almost lifted, and then he'd see in his mind all those pale girls fleeing his mother's table, and he'd swallow it down and call it kindness. Better she goes now, he told himself, before Ma wears her out. better at clean parting than years of misery. He was so busy protecting Ruth from a danger that no longer existed that he never noticed the danger that did, which was that he was about to lose her for good. Ruth started packing on a Thursday, and she was not a woman to beg, but she wasn't a coward either. And before she left that man's house, she meant to tell him one true thing. She found him in the barn. "You're a good man, Wes Dunbar," she said, "and the biggest fool I ever met. You spent this whole season looking at me like a starving man at a bakery window, and you'd rather I get on a stage Monday than say a single honest word." He stared at her. "You think you're sparing me your mother," Ruth said. "You're not. Your mother and I sorted ourselves out months ago. You're sparing yourself, because if you never reach for a thing, you can't watch it get taken away." Her voice gentled. "I know that fear. I buried a husband and a baby. But you don't outlive grief by refusing to love again, Wes. You just die slower." She turned and went back to her packing. He let her go. God help him. He let her go. Agnes watched all of it from the kitchen window. The barn, the parting. Her son standing there like a fence post while the best thing that ever crossed her threshold walked back to her trunk. That night, she went into Eliza's room for the first time in 3 years, took out the half-finished quilt, sat with it in her lap in the dark, the way her daughter had, and thought about all the things that get taken, and the rarer things that come and offer themselves and can still, through sheer human foolishness, be lost. Her son had his father's steadiness and her own hard grief, and between the two he was about to talk himself out of a whole life. Wes came in late and found her there, quilt in her lap, the clothes room open. "It's better this way, Ma," he said quietly, misreading everything as usual. "No bride would survive you. I won't do that to her." Agnes Dunbar looked at her son for a long, long moment. She said nothing, but something in her old face set like mortar. Sunday dinner was the next day. Ruth's stage left Monday. They ate that last Sunday dinner in a silence you could have leaned a ladder against. Wes pushed food around his plate. Ruth sat composed and courteous and finished, her trunk packed in the next room, her leaving as good as done. Agnes presided at the head of the table, as she had for 30 years, and watched her son be a coward, and watched the widow be brave, and waited until the plates were nearly clean. Then Agnes Dunbar set down her fork. The small sound of it stopped the room. She looked at her son, not unkindly, but with 30 years of iron behind it, and she asked him the question the whole valley would be repeating by Wednesday. "Wesley," she said, "when's the wedding?" Wes Dunbar's fork froze halfway to nowhere. "Ma." "You heard me. That woman is leaving on Monday's stage." Agnes's voice did not rise. It didn't have to. "And you are going to sit at this table and let her, because you've spent your whole fool life blaming me for your own cold feet." You think I chased those girls off to keep you," Agnes said. "You never once asked me why I chased them off." She folded her hands. "Every one of them wanted this ranch, Wesley, and not one of them wanted the work of it, or the grief of it, or a hard old woman who came with the bargain. They'd have smiled at you and folded at the first bad winter, and left you emptier than staying single ever would. I chased them off because I buried enough of this family. I wasn't going to watch you marry someone who'd run." Her eyes went, for just a moment, wet and fierce. "I have waited years for one who wouldn't run, and she is sitting at my table, and she has sorted me out and sat with my grief, and she is not afraid of me or of hard weather or of you. A breath, and you're about to put her on a stage. Over my dead body, Wesley Dunbar." The dragon everyone feared looked at her son. "Now, when's the wedding?" Wes turned to Ruth, and the whole shape of his life turned with him. Every wall he'd built, every loss he'd armored against, the fortress and the closed door and the 30 years of no bride would survive her, all of it standing revealed, in one Sunday dinner, as the excuse it had always been. His mother had never been the obstacle. He had. "Ruth," he started, and his voice broke on it. But Ruth Calloway, who had a spine of her own and had been let go once too often that week, held up one hand and stopped him. "No," she said, "not because your mother told you to. If you've something to ask me, Wes Dunbar, you ask it because you want it, in your own words, like a man who's decided to stop being afraid." The kitchen held its breath, And Wes Dunbar pushed back his chair and came around that long table and got down in front of the widow. He'd almost lost his own cowardice and asked her, in his own words, badly, honestly, with his heart finally out from behind the wall. Ruth let him finish. Then she said yes. They were married in the fall, in the little church in the valley, and the whole county came, half of them, if they were honest, just to see whether Agnes Dunbar would actually permit it. She did more than permit it. She sat in the front pew in her best black dress with her chin up and dared anyone to say a word. And when the vows were done, she was the first on her feet, and nobody in that church had ever seen the old dragon look like that. The closed room got open for good after the wedding. Ruth and Agnes finished Eliza's quilt together over that first winter, the two of them to frame in the evenings, the old woman stitches beside the young widow's. 3 years of unspoken grief going into cloth at last. It went on the marriage bed, which is exactly where Eliza, who'd been full of light and had loved her prickly mother fiercely, would have wanted it. Years later, when someone in the valley asked Agnes Dunbar, carefully, the way people still spoke to her, whether she thought the marriage would last, given her son's slow start and her own fearsome reputation, the old woman didn't give them the answer she'd given the whole world for 30 years. She didn't say, "We'll see." She looked at her daughter-in-law across the yard, hanging wash with grandchild on her hip, and her son coming in from the range with his eyes going soft at the sight of them, and Agnes Dunbar said the most certain thing she'd said in years. "It'll last. I made sure of it." Then she went back inside, to the house that had once been a fortress and was now simply full, and set a place at the Sunday table. Because it turned out the dragon, everyone feared, had only ever been the fiercest love in that house. They'd all just been too frightened to knock. Ruth Calloway hadn't, and no bride, it turned out, had ever needed to survive Agnes Dunbar. She'd only needed to see her.